Hello, I'm Marcia Kavanaugh. Thanks so much for joining us. Well, we could be heading for a pivotal weekend in politics, both in determining who governs and learning about what to expect in the future. We'll look tonight at the Senate runoff, plus some key local elections and the near extinction of the so-called yellow dog Democrats. We'll also revisit an ongoing series about state tax incentives and hope to learn what has worked and what has not. Working for us are tonight's Informed Sources. Errol, Laborde, producer of Informed Sources. Clancy DuBos, political columnist, Gambit Newspaper. Gordon Russell, managing editor for Investigations, The New Orleans Advocate. And Stephanie Grace, columnist, The New Orleans Advocate. Politics, runoff tomorrow, Senate, for the Senate. Clancy, what's it looking like?
Well, you know, the biggest story of this runoff campaign between Mary Landrieu and Bill Cassidy is not so much what's going to happen tomorrow, but what, if anything, will happen after tomorrow. Because the big story has not been who's ahead. Cassidy's been ahead since the primary, since before the primary. And while I'm not predicting, it is widely anticipated that he will win the race, and it won't be that close. But the big question, the big issue in this runoff campaign came just in the last 10 days. Allegations that Congressman Bill Cassidy, a medical doctor and formerly a full-time teaching doctor at LSU Health Sciences Center, kept a part-time position with tenure, which was not according to LSU's policies, but they made an exception to their policy that a part-time professor could keep tenure, and was allegedly doing work while working in Congress, also working for LSU. And there are some timesheets, but only 16 out of 63 timesheets have surfaced from LSU. They show a very inconsistent pattern of work. Sometimes there are no timesheets. And the Landrieu campaign has said this potentially constitutes payroll fraud. And I would even add that if there was something wrong there, and these timesheets were either faxed in or emailed in, that could be wire fraud. So there's all sorts of potential, there's a lot of smoke there already. There's a lot of potential fire. The voters aren't going to decide that issue. And what I told Channel 4 is they really need to have an independent investigator / prosecutor look at this, for the sake of the taxpayers and for the sake of Cassidy, because if he's done nothing wrong, then he deserves to be exonerated. But if he has done something wrong, then he should face consequences.
In terms of this campaign, Clancy, when does this information come out? When did the Landrieu camp know about this?
I only knew about it when it became a news story, but allegedly the Landrieu camp had this information for at least several months and was, the word is, shopping it around among various news entities and couldn't get anyone to bite until finally a couple of bloggers. Which again, thank God for those bloggers. You know, the bloggers break a lot of big stories, and one of them was Lamar from Sen Lamar, who writes a column out of Alexandria. He's a law student, by the way. And Jason Berry, not the novelist, but the blogger and videographer who writes a blog called American Zombie. They nailed this story from day one, and they've stayed on it. And then the daily newspapers and most of the TV stations picked it up, and it became a story.
And the Landrieu campaign really picked it up because she's, you know, she is trying to change the narrative. She's trying really hard to find something that will make this something other than a strictly partisan campaign, because if it's a partisan campaign, she loses. The state has gone Republican, and that really has been the dynamic. So she, you know, first Keystone Pipeline and now this. She's just trying to say this is not about Republican, Democrat. This is about the candidates, the people, the character.
And she's out there saying payroll fraud.
She is.
And she tried to make it a big issue in the debate. He tried, of course, to deflect it and talk about her use of airplanes and things like that. But, you know, right or wrong, she admitted what was wrong, the bookkeeping error, as she called it, on the flights,
really
and she repaid it. He has not repaid anything, so he just says, "Oh, LSU, this has been asked and answered," which reminds me a lot of David Vitter's response when the prostitution scandal gets brought up. He says, "I've already talked about that," but truth is, he hasn't. He's just saying he talked about it. But so
well, yet another example of how the Cassidy campaign echoes a lot of what David Vitter has done over the years, I think.
And I think it predicts, if you want to hear a prediction, I predict David Vitter, assuming he runs for governor, will run the same kind of Rose Garden virtual campaign. He won't show up a lot of places. It'll all be on television. But another prediction, I predict that the Republican-controlled House of Representatives Ethics committee will do nothing on this because they're going to treat it the same way they treated Vitter's prostitution scandal. They're going to say, well, this happened while he was in the House and he's now a senator, so we have no jurisdiction. And the Senate, which is now also controlled by Republicans, will say, well, this happened while he was in the House and we have no jurisdiction, which makes it a whitewash. So there really ought to be an independent look at this, not from the Obama administration, but someone truly independent who can bring resolution to this, both for Cassidy and the taxpayers.
Well, for the immediate, for tomorrow, what kind of impact do you think it's going to have?
It's not too little too late, but it is too late. I don't think it's a little deal. I think it's a big deal, but it has come too late. If this had come out 3 or 4 months ago, Rob Maness may be in the runoff, or Landrieu this may have turned in Landrieu's favor if it had come out, in September. So
well, of course, we're still
we'll
hearing from the Landrieu camp, yes, we can still do it, we can still do it. We've pulled it out before. What are the polls showing right now? What was the turnout like for early voting?
People are saying a Hail Mary or whatever, but I would argue that Mary Landrieu, who Gambit has endorsed, Mary has already had her 3 miracles for sainthood. So I think this time she may wind up being martyred.
There are a number of national reporters have been in writing their kind of Mary Landrieu, obituary. Some of them are calling it premature, but one of them came out today from the Atlantic, and the lead was something like, Mary Landrieu's dead and everybody knows it but Mary Landrieu.
Yeah.
I mean, it's really damning stuff.
And she had the front page of the Times today had a story about the end of the Democrats.
She is literally now the last Southern
Yeah.
Democrat in the Senate.
Yeah.
And also the last woman statewide office holder, female statewide in the state of Louisiana.
And there's no one really in the pipeline on that front either.
Is the GOP at all worried about complacency of just really low turnout, where maybe it actually might turn the table?
Well, Tommy Shadler, who's pretty good, Secretary of State Tom Shadler, who's pretty good at predicting these things, said 42%. That surprised me just because I expected turnout without studying it. I thought, turnout probably be around 25, 28%. 42% is a huge turnout for a December election in Louisiana. If it's that big, then I don't think it'll be close, and I think both of them will get their votes out. Maybe Cassidy even more so.
And the early, I'm sorry, Errol, did you want to say something?
Another thing, just throughout history, there's always been a time when there's been this vast amount of voters, this majority that has felt threatened by some movement within government, and they become defensive about that, and they want to make. When Abraham Lincoln was elected, I mean, people were so nervous about that they left the Union. I mean, from time to time, there's always been people who feel like they were about to lose their power,
taking our government back.
Their moral standards. I mean, people on the East Coast were upset when Andrew Jackson defeated John Quincy Adams. I mean, this always happens. And when Kennedy was elected, at that time, civil rights became an issue, and I think people felt like that their state sovereignty was being threatened. And that's what this reminds me of, in that Obama has become a symbol for that, a symbol for people feeling threatened about losing their authority and losing their power.
Well, and in fairness to those, I think Landrieu was right. I think there is a racial component to the antipathy against Barack Obama. But to give him credit, he is trying to be a transformative president. So he does threaten the status quo, not just with Obamacare or the Affordable Care Act, but a lot of other levels. He has said this. He really wants to be a transformative president for the United States, not necessarily not in a bad way, but whenever change happens, people who are vested in the status quo feel threatened.
And one of the ways he wants to do that is on environmentally, and that, of course, our oil and gas industry sees that as a tremendous threat, and that's played in this race.
We're going to talk about that a little bit more when we talk about the PSC race, and that's coming up in just a couple of minutes. First, I want to go over to Gordon right now. Gordon, the New Orleans Advocate, has run all week long this really in-depth series about tax breaks, tax incentives in the state of Louisiana, and what it's costing us.
Yeah, well, it's costing us a lot. We didn't look at every tax break or tax incentive. We looked at 6 programs that we thought were especially costly, and maybe there were some questions about whether the money was being spent well. We charted the growth of those, and they're costing us over $1 billion every year, and it's been on a pretty incredibly steep growth pattern. It's gone up from about 200 million. To more than $1 billion in just over a decade. And that coincidentally is sort of seems to be about the size of the annual budget deficit in Baton Rouge, give or take a couple $100 million. And also, coincidentally or not, it jives pretty nicely with the cuts to higher ed that we've seen in the last few years. So that was kind of the premise of this series, was looking at whether this money is getting us a return for our investment, and then what is it costing us in terms of what else we could be spending the money on.
So explain again, what are the incentives and what areas did you look into?
So we looked at 6 programs. There's 2 parts still to come. Tomorrow we have a story on the solar tax incentives. The other parts that we've done so far are the film program, the fracking or horizontal drilling, enterprise zones, which is a program designed to spur investment in poor areas. We did the mega projects, big industrial projects, and
Film?
I said film.
Inventory.
Inventory,
Yeah, the business
sorry.
inventory.
Business inventory tax, which is actually one of the most expensive ones, and it's kind of a very obscure thing, but it's a tax that's levied by local government that is then rebated by the state, and it's growing at an incredible rate.
Gordon, has the increase from 200 million to $1 billion or more, has it occurred because we've added incentives, or is it just an inflationary factor, or more people are buying into the existing programs?
It's a little bit of both. The solar program, for instance, is new, so that went from 0, say 5 or 6 years ago, to $60 million last year. And the film program is about 10 years old, but it's grown by leaps and bounds.
That's more from participation, I guess.
Right, and that's been on a really pretty steady uphill climb. Some of these programs are old, like the Enterprise Zone program has been costing in the neighborhood of $70 million a year for a while now.
And then the business inventory tax.
That one is on a steady,
That's on a
steady
increase.
growth, and that goes back to the late 90s. So a lot of these are 10, 15 years old, but they've been growing really rapidly, and there's been really no effort to slow that growth.
But all of these play and originate with somebody's interest. They're helping somebody.
Right.
Is it politically possible, Clancy, I'll ask, for someone to run for office and say, vote for me and I'm going to get rid of these programs?
If you say it like that, no, that would not be a good campaign theme. But if I'm reminded of Lawrence Shahardy Sr., the elder Lawrence Shahardy, the first Shahardy who was an assessor in Jefferson Parish, if he said, I'm going to phase out these business exemptions because otherwise taxpayers are going to have a tax increase, that might be a more saleable theme. But to simply say, I'm going to start taxing business is not a good thing, because that's who gives most of the money. But it's going to require a balancing act. For example, and Gordon was saying earlier, before we came on the air, that this whole business inventory tax rebate is really what it is, because the tax gets collected. The reason that's going to be hard to repeal is because local governments depend on, that's actually a millage imposed on inventory. So local governments get that money, and local governments are starved as it is. So if they just said we're going to wipe it out, they wouldn't. They'd save money at the state, but they would starve local governments of badly needed revenue.
Or they'd have to pass a tax increase.
And they have to make it up
local,
somewhere else, with a sales tax or a property tax on individuals.
Right, or on
businesses.
business, yeah. That's true, and I was going to add to what Clancy said. I mean, I think some of these programs would be easier to kill than others. I mean, I think the oil and gas industry is obviously very powerful in this state, and to kill the horizontal drilling exemption, I think, would be an uphill climb. I mean, I think the industry would actually agree to some sort of paring back of that. Some of these other ones, I mean, solar is actually already being phased out.
Yeah.
Not surprisingly, again, for the same reasons somewhat. And then I think the film tax incentive has a lot of supporters, but it has a lot of detractors too.
I think there's a movement to try to, I don't know if they're going to cap it or reform it or do something.
There's definitely a movement to pare it back. And there's I think some of the rural legislators feel like it's just a boondoggle and they get nothing from it. And they really don't get anything from it, because almost all the film activity takes place in New Orleans and Baton Rouge and Shreveport. I mean, once in a while you see one of these 12 Years a Slave films in some rural parish or something, but basically it's pretty much happening in the cities.
Even the State Economic Development Director, Stephen Moray, is saying that he's questioning some of these incentives.
Yeah, he really thinks the Enterprise Zone program is broken, and especially some of the stuff that they've done that's just really wrong-headed, like subsidizing retail, which is just the pie. People don't shop more because there's more stores, so it's really not something. The retail goes where they think they can make money,
and they're going to these areas.
There's no reason for the government to give retailers money.
and retailers
And
in
we're talking
St.
about
Tammany
Walmart, talking about
Parish,
the-
not
Yeah.
impoverished places here.
Yeah, and
Walmart's
the
kind of a
world's
trifecta.
largest
I
retailer.
mean,
Walmart,
Walmart, it's like they're offering poor, lousy jobs for people, and they, there's 5 reasons why we shouldn't be subsidizing Walmart.
because originally our enterprise zone was to do something kind of in the inner city
Right.
for
Right.
urban poor,
But now they're
or
paying
even
to
rural
put them
poor.
in Mandeville and Covington.
So they can go
Those
anywhere.
poor,
So
those poor shoppers in there.
are we going
They need that one.
to see any movement toward making improvements in this, do you think?
I think it's going to be a real issue in the governor's race, and that's actually, I was going to say, the piece on Sunday is going to look at what the 4 announced candidates for governor are saying about this, which, they're not giving a lot of detail yet, but they are talking about it, and I think there will be a move to peel some of this back. How far they go, I don't know. And one of the things we wrote about in the series is that every time you establish one of these programs, you create a very entrenched interest group that is going to fight any kind of change tooth and nail.
To keep it there. Well, you mentioned when you first started talking about cuts to higher education. We saw that this week. University of New Orleans announcing that it's closing programs. Errol?
Yeah, a couple of weeks ago, that the President Peter Foss had asked a committee to look at the curriculum and to make recommendations, and they did. And pretty much what he did was adopt those recommendations. Most of the cuts are in education, some education programs that just weren't very big operations. One that kind of hits home to all of us. I got to say, we're not an impartial panel. I mean, Clancy and I have both been recognized by the alumni. Marcia was the original Miss UNO.
Alice UNO. That far back.
We won't talk about it.
But it's easy to be partial to UNO because there's no doubt that it serves a tremendous community service. But yeah, he is going to go ahead and recommend most of the cuts. The one in the political science department, I think, is the most visual. It's essentially getting rid of the graduate program. I think there'd still be some courses at the undergraduate level. Eliminating the geography department totally. Really cutting down on adjunct professors' positions.
They're also cutting back on graduate and PhD programs in special ed, which was a tremendous. My sister has a PhD from UNO in special ed, so I mean, it hit home to me because she and many others of her contemporaries went on to great careers in special ed. So they had a fine program, but it's being cut because I guess it costs a lot because you got to provide clinicals and things like that. But it's going to affect not just the academic community, don't you think, Errol? But something like that's going to affect the community at large.
The community at large, right.
But also by getting rid of those adjunct professors, that means they're going to need to go to the tenured professors and make all of them teach 2 courses each semester, and some of them are research professors, and so that's going to make it more difficult to recruit really good professors to come here, and so it's bad all around, except that some departments that are doing well just have the hope that with these other things out of the way, more attention can be given to them, and what funding emerges can go to them, and so that what survives can get better. And if that happens, then I guess that could be one possible happy outcome for this. But it still has to be approved by the ULL board.
The political science department graduate programs, master's and PhD, being eliminated, how does that impact the UNO Survey Research Center, which is really a very valuable tool here?
Happily, that Survey Research Center is going to continue. We spoke, Steffi and I had dinner the other night with Dr. Ed Shervanak, who runs that Survey Research Center, and that was spared, but it's going to be shifted over to another department or work in collaboration with another department
Public administration.
so they can keep it, which is a good thing because that survey is invaluable, not just as a good research source, but it really provides a wonderful annual or biannual picture of the quality of life going back to what, 1986, I think? Errol, you and I probably covered the first one that Susan Howell did back. We're all dating ourselves here, but that's a really important part of it. And it brings UNO into the community in a very big public way and in a valuable way. So I'm glad they were able to save that.
So it is preserved. That's good news.
I was going to mention real quick that these candidates for governor that I interviewed for this story on Sunday, they all said they think the cuts to higher ed have been too steep and they want to try to rebuild some of that. So maybe there will be some good news down the road.
Okay. All right. Well, on to more politics. Always more politics,
Always.
as we have other elections going on tomorrow too. PSC.
PSC. Well, if you're watching TV and you see Barack Obama's face come up, you might think you're watching a Senate ad. You might be watching a PSC ad these days, because the Public Service Commission election in the 1st District, that's between the incumbent Eric Skrmeta and the challenger Forrest Wright, has gotten very partisan. And it's interesting because it's between two Republicans in a very Republican district.
One of them used to have a beard, apparently.
Yes, and be
we
a
know what that
Democrat,
means.
yes, and support Barack Obama, which is, there's a lot of money. Eric Scametta got a real scare in the primary. He got pushed, obviously, into a runoff. There was a third candidate, Alione, and his supporters are really coming out in force and doing a tremendously expensive, aggressive media campaign. Steve Scalise, the number 3 representative in the House, is doing TV ads for him. And what they're doing is basically saying Forrest Wright is A, fake Republican, and B, an environmentalist and someone who supports the solar industry, has a lot of support from the solar industry. And because of that, because he wants to use more solar industry, that would make, the argument is that would raise people's rates, basically. And it's just, it's a real, I think they probably saw that Bill Cassidy was successful in what he was doing. And
in bringing up
Fear
Obama.
works is what they're saying,
yeah, even though it's pretty distant.
So how is the race then looking right now between the two of them? Can anybody call it, or?
No, I couldn't. The only poll that I read about, Stephanie probably saw the same one, the latest poll, which is not that recent anymore, had Wright ahead 55-45. But in a race that's not getting a lot of publicity, that could change.
It could. And again, I think there are going to be a lot of people who of the people who turn out, I think a lot of them are pretty serious Republicans who want to drive put Mary Landrieu out of business. They might, this message that Eric Scametta is the real Republican might really resonate with them. So
I'm wondering if, because like you said in your opening statement about this, that you see Barack Obama's face, have they seen so much in the Senate race that they say, oh, here comes another senator, and they just turn off, and because it didn't really come out until this week, I think.
Right, and there are mailers.
So, and the mailers, and people, you're getting so many mailers from this and that organization. Like, I know what I do, and I eat and breathe politics. I get these mailers, I just toss them.
Right,
I don't even
fatigue
look
has set
at 'em.
in, there's
Yes.
no
And
doubt
And I
about
can only
that.
imagine what the average voter who's, doing something other than eating and breathing politics like I do is doing with it. So I don't know. Tomorrow will tell. It'll be,
We'll
to
find
me,
out
that's
tomorrow.
the most interesting race
It
on
really
the ballot
is.
in terms of not knowing what might happen
Right.
and having it swing back and forth and some everything from firebombing at Forrest Bradley Wright's campaign
and
workers' house.
arguments over who's more, who's a defender versus an attacker of the Catholic Church. I mean, it's gotten into some weird places.
For a PSC race,
for a
yeah.
PSC
I'm waiting for
race.
Pope Francis to tell me who to vote for in that race.
Archbishop Haddon's great nephew did
Yeah,
that,
that's right.
and yes.
St. Tammany DA.
But there was a time, we'll talk more about this in a few minutes, like when all of the politicians were Democrats, but when people can see the shift in attitudes, that Democrats, especially in the suburbs, quickly became Republicans before they ran for office. And so that is not unusual, what you
Right.
saw. Now, it is less, that happens less frequently because now they're entering politics as
Republicans, sure.
But there was a time when everybody converted somewhere along the line.
Including Ronald Reagan,
That's right.
St. Ronald of the Republican Party.
And Bill Cassidy, our possible future Republican senator.
St. Tammany DA.
St. Tammany
I'm trying to
DA, another
get us
interesting
there.
one. This, of course, is to replace Walter Reed, who's under investigation, tremendous fire for all sorts of things. We're down to 2 candidates, Brian Traynor and Warren Montgomery, and it's really kind of an insider-outsider dynamic. Brian Traynor is someone who worked for Sheriff Jack Strain and also for Walter Reed, and Warren Montgomery is a defense attorney, although he has actually been
He was a
U.S. attorney
prosecutor
a long time ago.
many years ago, yeah.
So again, it's very heated. The accusations are flying, as they always do at this stage. Montgomery is saying Traynor has not done enough felony work. Traynor is saying Montgomery
Defends
defends criminals because guess what?
That's
He's a
what
defense
defense
attorney, and that's what they do.
Right.
So there have been cease and desist letters. I mean, we're really down to the kind of scrapping at each
it
other.
seems like it's kind of shaping up into, Tammany is in this place where there's a lot of, with the Peter Galvin scandal and the Walter Reed scandal, there's a little bit of a throw the bums out mentality, and then it's competing with, this is sort of a referendum on do we want to elect somebody who we see as part of the old system or a new person, and then Traynor is kind of positioning himself as a guy who's supported by a lot of the powerful people in the parish, but isn't too closely
It's still a
tied to
change
Walter
agent
Reed.
somehow.
Yeah.
Well,
It's
we
kind of
go
a-
to the polls tomorrow. If we're going to get to Errol for this very
Okay.
last segment, we have to
Okay.
end this discussion and
Okay.
over to Errol right now about Yellow Dog Democrats and quickly.
Well, that's what I mentioned because this could be like the last night for yellow dogs. There was a time going into the 50s and the 60s when all Southern politicians were Democrats, and that traced back to the Civil War. I mean, you just had to be a Democrat. But within the Democrats, there was a real division. There was conservative Democrats, and then there were those Democrats who were loyal to the mainstream Democratic Party. And that became more and more of an issue as civil rights became more and more of an issue, and the whole states' rights sort of issues. And so when you saw people like Strom Thurmond and George Wallace, that there were Democrats who supported them, but those were not the candidates of the mainstream Democratic Party. So those who identified with the mainstream Democratic Party, people who may not have liked it, would have supported somebody like Hubert Humphrey or somebody, that they were called the Yellow Dogs. They were the old-time Democratic loyalists, and there was a core of Yellow Dogs in New Orleans. That New Orleans was the center of it. I think certainly young Moon Landrieu, as he got into politics, was that. Michael O'Keefe was very active in that, and we're seeing and so I think Mary Landrieu inherited that lineage from it, and it's become less relevant through the years. And over time, of course, all of the Democrats started converting to Republicans, and Republicans started winning, and so it wasn't an issue. But it did speak back to a time when there was an issue that divided the country, and it was primarily the civil rights issue. That people took a stand on it.
And I have to come in and ask you, have the dogs seen their day, the Yellow Dogs seen their day? Is that just
I would
sort of
think
over?
so, yeah.
Okay, all right, and we are looking ahead now quickly.
Okay, Gallier Hall undergoing a lot of renovation. It will still have a minor presence during Mardi Gras, but the parades will be reviewed from across the street on the Lafayette Square side.
Interesting. Clancy.
I predict that on Monday the governor's race will start.
Probably an accurate prediction. Gordon.
Well, since things went so well last weekend, I'll offer up another prediction of a Saints win on Sunday, and we're still going to make the playoffs with a losing record.
Okay, we're going to have to keep having you here doing that then, if we're on a roll. Stephanie?
Following up on Clancy, I think all eyes, no matter what happens to Mary Landrieu, all eyes turn to Mitch Landrieu on Monday, because one of the big unanswered questions in the governor's race is whether Mitch Landrieu is going to go for it.
Yeah.
And he obviously is looking at what's happening to his sister very closely.
Election day tomorrow, runoffs, polls open, what, 7 a.m., I think
7
it is?
a.m. to
7
8
a.m.,
p.m.
so make sure you go vote. Thanks, guys, for being here. Thank you so much for joining us, and of course, we want to see you again next week for Informed Sources. Have a good evening.